offer support, but I have never set up a live stream with Zoom.
Yeah, it's all good. I think it's working. Cool. See some viewers start popping in here. Zoom launch thing looks like it's having issues, but the YouTube side looks like it's working.
Well, if we get viewers pop in, I'm sure they'll let us know pretty quick if something's wrong. So
Yeah, exactly, right? If anyone's out there, maybe just drop comments so we know that everything's working all right before we get going here. How's the weather out your way?
it's starting to feel like spring for sure. I know you guys have had like wildly warm weather for a
Hmm.
while now. We had a couple of pretty gnarly snowstorms through February, and then last week was like 100 millimeters of rain.
Yeah.
Um, and then today was like 10 degrees and sunny, and it's supposed to be somewhere between 5 and 10 for the next few days. So I think I think we're through the worst of it. I think
Yeah.
spring is coming.
Nice. What's the salmon fishing looking like for the spring?
So we don't have a spring salmon season here.
Hmm.
I mean, there are kelts in the rivers, but there's no season on them. New Brunswick has a kelt season, so I don't think I've ever gone up to do it though. It's I know like there are people here that fish kelts illegally, but it's I don't know.
Put up my hand prematurely there. Not there. I haven't, but
No,
yeah.
yeah, it's one of those things like the studies all show that like they recover better in the cold water and they're feeding and I don't know. It feels like the kind of thing, controversial opinion. I feel like we should probably have a Celt season and then not a summer season.
Hmm.
Like once mid July, August rolls around, maybe you shut it down until the fall. But
It
of
makes
course,
sense.
that's
Time to go. Yeah.
season dependent, I guess. But
I mean, ideally just do it year by year, kind of call it on a dime, but it's not good for tourism.
no, it's not. People don't love planning trips around maybes.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Well, I had a few folks say that everything's working fine, so that's good.
Great news.
Confirmation there. Cool. So maybe start with a little introduction. I know we had that little teaser video out, but you're a casting instructor, guide. Tell us a bit about, how you started and what you do.
Yeah, sure thing. I mean, that's about the sum of it. I'm a passionate fly tyer casting instructor, fly fishing guide. I started fishing when I was a wee child. I grew up on the Shubenacadie River here in Nova Scotia, which is a Bay of Fundy tidal river. It's got a huge run of striped bass. So I grew up just, throwing bait for striped bass on the banks, and picked up fly fishing as a means of doing something to pass the summers and the falls. I was like a pretty addicted snowboarder when I was a kid, and then I would get depressed in like March when the season would end. I needed something to fill the hole, and it's totally turned on its head at this point. I'm far more into the fly fishing than I am the snowboarding, which is fine. Life has its turns. Um, I started fly fishing probably 12 or 13 years ago. A close family friend, another like ski family that we hung out with, turned out to also be a fly fisher. So he took me under his wing, and he was actually very influenced by steelhead culture, primarily like Skagit culture and stuff. And so was one of the earlier adopters of two-handed rods in Nova Scotia. And I fell in love with that pretty early under his guidance. And yeah, I got real nerdy about the casting over the years. And I've never been a quick study when it comes to physical things. So it took me a number of years to kind of dial it all in. But at this point, I'm pretty proficient and I feel confident teaching other people and sharing that with people. And I don't know, it's something I love to do. So if you find me on a river and you got a two-handed rod in your hands, step up.
Cool. Do you fish a single header much at all?
I mean, I fish for things other than salmon, and so often when I fish for non-salmon, there's a single hand rod involved. I finally picked up a single hand salmon rod last year and fished a single hand salmon rod for the first time in like 12 years of fishing. So it's been largely a two-handed thing for me. Even on my single hand rods, though, like single hand spay lines, wolf ambushes, and single hand space, scientific anglers, stuff like that.
Yeah. Nice. Very cool. And so you're down Chester. Which rivers are
Mhm.
you guiding mainly?
I mean, for the most part, I end up guiding through events. So I'll end up guiding on the Marguerite or the middle of the deck for salmon stuff or trout stuff. In the summertime, I've done like a little bit down here on like the middle of the Medway, rivers that probably don't mean much to people outside of Nova Scotia, but mean a lot to me in my little corner of the world. We have kind of a tough situation down here where we have a lot of invasive species in our rivers, kind of south of the 102 in Nova Scotia. And so I don't love to guide for those. I don't love taking money for an invasive, to each their own, but not for me. So usually my guiding ends up being through events in troutier parts of the province.
Okay. Cool. Nice. So, if anyone hasn't seen your stuff on Instagram, Mitchell is just an awesome tire of, I mean, all kinds of flies, but specifically sort of your more classic salmon patterns. We're going to talk a couple more sort of classic-ish, but more fishing style flies today. So we're going to do a rusty rat warm up, awesome hair wing, one of I think it was one of kind of the first hair wings that really came to Canada or was invented in New Brunswick, I guess. Can
Mhm.
correct me if I have that wrong, but I think I remember reading it was one of the very early kind of hair wings there. And then we'll do a Lady Caroline, right? That's the plan.
Yeah, that's the
One of
plan.
those.
Yeah, I think you're right about the rusty rat. I'm not as well read on our hair wings, but if memory serves, yeah, one of the earlier hair wings developed here. Most hair wings, at least the ones we started with, came from traditional patterns.
Mhm.
People just didn't have the materials to tie them here, so they're like, slap some mousse on it and call it a day.
It's true. Like
But
you'd see
yeah,
a charm or something. The original is, I can't remember if it's teal or bronze mallard, but that or so many of them are. You're right. They just swap out whatever the original winging was, green highlander for some squirrel or some bucktail or whatever. But yeah, that was designed to be a hair wing. So kind of cool.
yeah, absolutely. Well, I
Cool.
guess we'll get started with it.
Yeah.
I'm pretty basic when it comes to hooks. Let me just switch my camera over here.
While you're doing
And
that,
you
I
can let
should
me know.
say I'll let Mitchell just kind of run this part of the show. But if anyone has questions as we're tying along here, then just shut them out and I'll ask Mitchell along the way. With that,
Perfect.
all yours.
Does that look clear to you there, Chris? If
Looks
I throw
awesome.
my hand here, everything's focused.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, cool. We're gonna start off. I'm fairly basic with my hooks. This is kind of blown out with the lighting or whatever, but this is a Mustad SL73. Replaced the old 36890s that essentially everybody on the East Coast used for salmon hooks at one point in time. They're relatively inexpensive, and they have caught me plenty of fish. So I don't really ever see the point in going to something a little bit more expensive. The very first thing I do when I'm tying a fly for fishing, I am basically I have a head like a sieve, so I will forget things in a moment. So the very first thing I do is pinch the barb at the vise. Um, we have to fish single barbless hooks for Atlantic salmon here, unweighted flies. And if I don't pinch it now, I will forget to pinch it later. And it is a hefty fine if you forget and you're caught with it. So don't do that. It happened to a friend of mine once. The CO tried everything to like cut him a break. And he was like, "Oh, maybe you just tied that fly on and you haven't fished it yet." And my friend was, ever naive. It's like, "No, no, no, I've been fishing it for a little while." And we're like, "Oh no, please stop talking." And anyway, he got the fine. It's 300 some odd dollars. I'm gonna start back right up by this return eye. All these hooks have a return on them, and I'm basically gonna construct my fly such as to fill that bump in. I don't want that bump to show up in the final fly as much as possible. Now this fly has a tag of gold tinsel, so I'm going to cut my waste piece of thread there. If I didn't have a tag, I would leave it, and you'll see that on the Lady Caroline, and I'll explain why. But essentially, what I like to do to keep a nice even underbody, I'll tie this in alongside right by that bump, and then I'll hold this out at a 45-degree angle to the hook, and I'll let my thread sort of fall down it like a ramp so that all of my turns are touching one another. So I've got a lot of pressure with my left hand on the gold tinsel, and I've got fairly little pressure on my right hand with the thread. I'm going to go all the way. So you see, if I let my thread dangle, it's currently touching the point of the hook. That's where I want my body to start on all these flies. That's the proportions. So I'm going to go about 3 mil or so back from that. And that's where I want my tag to extend. So I'm only looking for about 4 or 5 turns of tag on this guy. Even on really big traditional flies, 4 turns is about as much as I would do. Okay, so 4 looks great. I just threw a couple of loose wraps to bring my thread ahead and get it out of the way, and I'll bring it back. Can always take wraps away. Get a couple of turns in here to lock that in, and then we'll. Oh, we have our tag. The next part is our tail. So I'm going to just cover this up a little bit, and I'm going to try and build up a little bit of thread right here, because otherwise I'll have a bit of a bump, and that's going to want to kick my tail upwards really bad. I don't necessarily want that. The
You
tail
want to
on a
try?
rusty rat.
I don't
What's
know
that,
if it
sorry?
would be really practical to do. Could you back that light off a little bit, do you think? Just thinking it might. Yeah, that's probably good there.
I
As long
just
as you can
turned it a
still.
little bit. Oh yeah, I can see. I
Okay,
can probably
cool.
tie one of these in the dark. Cool. So the tail on one of these guys is peacock sword feathers. So I've got a section of the top of a peacock sword here, and I've sort of separated out 4 or 5 fibers. I don't need too many, and I'm going to cut them stem and all. So I'm going to cut the stem away with them because these guys are notorious for wanting to go everywhere when you tie them down. So if I cut them stem and all and I start to line them up, twist them around the way I want them to kind of go upwards if I can. So I'm going to set those on the hook upside down. I'm going to get the length I want. So I'm looking for about 1.5 times the gap of the hook. So once I've got that where I want it, I'm going to try a pinch wrap and see how that looks. It's not terrible. The water will straighten it all out. If I'm tying a traditional fly, I will give a lot of care to how the tail sits. If I'm tying a fishing fly, so long as it's not completely lopsided, I think we're good to go. So I'm just chopping away that stem there now. Now the rusty rat has a two-tone body. The back half is a pumpkin or orange colored floss. That's the rust of the rusty rat. And then the front half is peacock herl. But before either of those goes down, I need a rib. So I'm going to come all the way back up to that return eye again. Again, trying to fill that gap. So I'm going to tie my rib in right behind that. The rib is just oval gold tinsel. This is a slightly larger size than what I tied in for the tip. So it was small, that was an extra small. Tie that right along the side. Oh, couple. Come on down. All right, it's not cooperating, so I'm just going to push it back there. Oh. Now we're on side, we're filling that gap in. Same thing, 45-degree angle. And I'm holding this one slightly downwards because I want my rib to start probably at about if I was looking at the hook straight on this way, and this is noon, and this is 6, I probably want it somewhere around like the 7 o'clock position, the 8 o'clock position. Not quite under the hook, but close, off to the side, so that my first turn of rib is nice and full and close to the back. So I've got that where I want it. I'm going to advance my thread to about the halfway mark, or I'm going to start the back half of the body. So that's going to be somewhere around here. I'm going to grab my uni pumpkin floss. I think pumpkin probably, I don't know, other brands probably have different names for these shades, but Uni's pumpkin is pretty hard to beat in terms of the color match. This is a 1 strand floss. I would prefer a 4 strand and split 1 strand out of it. I find that those 4 strand flosses are like a little bit flatter. They don't coil when you take the 1 strand out. You'll notice like this is kind of coiled up a little bit. So I'll have to work a little harder to get it to lay flat, but that's okay. I'm going to tie it in with a bit of a extra going forward because we're going to need it in a minute. I'm just going to move my thread out of the way. Let this guy slip over here. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to start my first turn, and then I'm going to start twisting this. Every brand is a little different for what way it's spun on the spool. Looks like this one, if I twist it counterclockwise, it wants to lay flatter. So I'm going to keep that in mind as I'm going, and I'm going to be constantly making a turn, twisting a little bit, getting it to lay flat. I want my body to be as smooth as I can get it. Constantly just making up for that twist.
Do you find any difference, Mitchell, in like where you grab the floss in relation to how flat it goes, like how far away you're holding it?
I find if I'm holding it nice and far away, I can like get a good sense of how flat the whole thing is. Like if I hold it close, sure I can get that one little section flat, but I can get a nice big wide section flat this way. And also, maybe not as important for your fishing flies, but especially on traditional flies, your fingers have grease on them. And if you're wrapping floss over a long body with greasy fingers and you're handling all that floss that's going right on the hook, it's gonna show up. It's gonna tarnish the floss. Like I said, not as important for these fishing flies, but at least if you're holding it farther away, you're probably rubbing a little bit less on the stuff that you're currently wrapping. Okay, that is that. I'll bring my thread back off all those turns I made. And now what I'm going to do is finish this on. So the Rusty Rat has a veiling, which is not so popular in a lot of modern hairwing flies, but was very popular in traditional salmon flies. Not usually veilings of floss, mind you, but veilings. So I'm going to push these back out of the way and fold them back over, and we'll trim those to size here in a minute. Now I'm going to tie my peacock curls in. Where did I set those? Here we are. You can tell a very modern bag of peacock curl, definitely packaged in the 21st century. Uh, I mean, I've got so much peacock curl at this point from old collections that I don't think I'll ever go through it all, not for the amount that I use it anyway. So I've got 4 or 5 strands. I'm going to break the tips off because they're usually pretty brittle, as is evidenced by being able to just break them off. I'm going to tie these in right where I left off. And I'm not going to advance the thread too far. I'm going to let it dangle because these several strands, just let go one, will want to separate. If I let the thread be far away, this way it keeps them held together. It up. Notice I didn't worry too much about my tag ends because I'm just covering them with the wraps. As long as they're secure, I don't really care. You will never see them under there. There, now we're at the front. A couple of securing wraps there, and I'm just going to break these off 1 or 2 at a time. Break them off nice and close. Oh, yeah, rib. For some reason, there's people will say it's because it's traditional, but it isn't. Um, we do 5 ribs on salmon flies. I have yet to find the book, the traditional book that says that that's what you do, but everyone seems to think that's what you're supposed to do. So you do 5 evenly spaced ribs, as even as you can get them. Fish aren't going to count. It won't matter. They don't fish better when there's 5 or 4 or 6 or 12 or 13. Okay, that's the body of the fly dealt with. Does anyone have any questions so far? Is the chat satisfied with what they're seeing?
Seems to be. Nobody crying bloody murder yet. Butchered the fly.
Butchered it, ruined it.
Well, it looks
No
really good.
self-respecting fish would ever take this.
Yeah.
All right, so I just cut the veiling there. I'm looking for basically underwing length, so my wing is going to go a little bit longer than that. It doesn't super matter. I've seen some people tie it all the way to the back of the tail and then tie the wing into there too. I've seen some people just cover the body. I don't think it matters too much. It's mostly just to give a little pop of color that's moving. Okay, so the wing. The material varies depending on who ties it, right? But I believe the traditional material is the guard hairs of a gray fox. So you'll see this patch of gray fox here. It's not a very big one, but we don't need too much. A lot of fluff, very, very fluffy fur. So when I'm picking my clump of fur to tie in, I'm only looking at the guard hairs. So the rest of it, it's going to look like a lot, but I only want the guard hairs. So I'm going to separate out a fairly decent sized clump, about that much, right? Because I only want those little gray guard hairs. I'm going to grab my scissors, cut those all away. Great. And we have a great fuzzy mess. But here are the guard hairs that I want. Here's all the fuzz I now have to deal with. So you could do this with a comb. I've never found it to work any better than just sort of separating them out in a little fan, pinch really tight, and then just sort of like make a bunch of quick little strokes on the end of those fibers. And then they'll all just sort of start falling out, right? Lots and lots of fluff. Keep a nice pinch on those guard hairs that we want to keep. And then just keep working the fluff out. We don't need any of it. It's all just going to add bulk we don't need. So when you're done, what you end up with is actually quite a small little amount of hairs, right? I'm going to just take these and I'm going to sort of align them. These are kind of a little bit too soft for the hair stacker to work effectively, so I'm just going to align them myself. I'm just sort of running my fingers over them and I'm taking out the long hairs and I'm setting them back in the stack until I get a nice little bundle that's mostly in line. So now I'm going to get this measured. Like I said, I want it to be a little bit longer than that veil, somewhere near the end of the tail. Actually, an important step. This is science. This stuff's homemade. I don't remember who made it. My dear friend Tyler gave it to me. But it's always some parts rosin, some parts castor oil, and some part beeswax. But I'm waxing here because these little guard hairs don't quite compress as nicely as their softer counterparts. And things that don't compress want to roll and slip. The wax takes care of that. I'm just going to add a few more wraps right there. And that is looking mostly how I would like it to look. I'm going to give it the old push just to get it to lay a little lower. Give it some, yeah, there we go. Good enough. And now this fly is collared, so I can get away with tying down these butt ends a little bit farther up. I kind of want a nice level base to wrap on. We did get a few that are a pesky length to get my fingers on. Let's get under those best we can. If there's anything still in the way, we're just going to put a wrap in front of it, fold it all. Yeah, so we got kind of a little ugly tie-in point here now. But like I said, we want something kind of flat tie on so that when we tie down our grizzly hen, it all wants to lay flat. It's not going to slip down a little ramp. So I'm going to pick out an appropriately sized grizzly hen feather. The length for throats, you kind of want, if you pictured a 45-degree angle from the point of the throat, that 45 degrees should put the tips of the feather at the same height as the hook point. At least that's the measurement that I use. And it seems to work out. These ones are probably about that length. So I'm going to measure real quick. I'm going to take this fiber and hold it up here and just do a quick little size check. So to my eye, that looks like it's going to be about right. The fish doesn't really care. This is mostly to catch anglers, not to catch salmon. I've seen some salmon landed on some pretty rub ugly flies, and I've seen some salmon ignore some pretty beautiful flies. So, okay, so
Do
I've
you
stripped
think
away.
sorry to
What's
interrupt
that?
there.
Sorry.
I was gonna ask maybe save or just think about for the break, but what do you think makes for a good salmon fly, fishing wise?
I wish I knew the answer. Um, it depends on the conditions, right? Do you want me to freestyle that answer now, or do you want to talk about it later?
No, let's talk about it later.
Okay, cool. I definitely have opinions on the matter, don't we all? All right, we're back to my wax again. Hackle tips are slippery. So if you ever find that you're trying to wrap hackles and they pull out on you, the wax will save you. I'll say that and then it'll slip out on me. All right, so I'm going to get a couple of good turns. Lock that down. I like to fold my hackles once they're tied on. So at this point, I've tied it in by this little tip. I'm going to pick it up. And this is a Tim Flagler, a Tightline Productions trick. He kind of like uses the stem and furls it and folds it down that way. So you're almost sort of like pulling up and folding at the same time. It doesn't super matter so long as they're all starting to lay that way. And I'll palmer that first turn around just to make sure everything is starting. Cool. Great. We're laying the way I want. So now we can do one turn in front of the other and we can use up all this hackle. I probably want about 3 turns. I just so happen to have about 3 turns right there. All right, I'll lock that down. Oh, let's flip that off. We're just about done. The rusty rat has a red head though, so we have to account for that. You could just tie the whole thing with red instead of black, but I have a material that I love. So I'm going to whip finish this off with just a few turns. Probably 1, 2, 3. And if at all possible, when you're whip finishing, you should always whip finish forwards each turn in front of the last one, uh, because they're basically a nail knot. If you tied a nail knot with the turns all overlapping, that would be strange. It would not hold as well. This is Glow Bright. So Glow Bright is a fluorescent floss, and it takes a bobbin really nicely. It doesn't fray out on you. It's got a little bit of stretch. So I'm going to do is I'm going to start that right at the very end of the black turns, and I'm going to do all the way up until I've got 1 turn left before I'm covering all the black, and then I'm going to cut the waist end off because I'll never get that all the way down. And this way, my last turn, I'll spin it just to flatten it out like I did my body floss. We'll cover that waist piece. So now that I've covered it, all the black on the way up, I'm going to cover it a second time on the way down, but I'm going to do that while whip finishing. So I'm going to get my whip finisher ready. Again, I just flatten this all out, so it's going to lay nice and flat. I'm going to carefully place these turns, probably a 4 turn whip finish to make my way back down. And then you get a nice, smooth red head. It's not going anywhere. There's your rusty rat. I'll put a little bit of head cement on this guy and it'll be ready for June.
Nice. Love it. There are a few do you ever tie the variations or I'm sure you've
Uh,
tied them, fish them like the blue rat, silver rat.
yeah, I've tied a gray rat. I have a book that lists like probably 10 different variations of the rusty rat.
Yeah, I feel like whoever
But the gray
lodges
rat
developed
spoke to me.
nuts.
What's that? Sorry.
I think it was a lodge it was developed at, and the inventor just went nuts, like decided that this was his thing, and it would be the fly.
It's the one.
Yeah.
Everyone loves to invent something by changing one material.
Yep.
Anyway, there's your rusty rat for anyone online. I don't know if anybody's tying along. I should have posted a materials list. That would have been a cool thing to do. People could have tied along.
Yeah. Well, this will always
Cool.
be there for anyone who wants to go back and watch too. So,
If you
Justin did
do, tag me
ask.
in it.
I wasn't sure if he missed it, but what size of thread were you using?
That is Uni A dot. I guess it's you can't really tell because it's in my right bobbin, but that's my go-to size for almost everything, to be honest with you. On my traditional flies, I use some kind of a thin white thread for the entire underbody process, and then as soon as I get up to the head, we go to Uni A dot. It's hard to beat thread.
Yeah. Nice. Chris was asking if for squirrel and bear wings, if you ever cut the wing material to length first and then tie it in.
That is 100% the way that I do it. I have a great little trick that my friend John Scott taught me many years ago. I wax the hell out of my thread. I give it a counterclockwise spin to make it want to skip backwards on the hook. And then I will do a kind of loose wrap and I will cut in to those cut ends of the squirrel or the bear, whatever the slippery material is. And I'll wrap down and then I'll cut in a next bit and then I'll cut in the next bit. So I've divided the clump into three sections, and each of those three sections are tied down with their own waxed wraps.
Yeah.
And then it does not move.
Yeah. Use that all the time for bucktail too. It's a great one for sure.
It's a real handy trick. Yeah, that's the only way I think squirrel tail can be tamed.
Yeah. Yeah, it's annoying. Do you taper those ends at all when you cut that clump? Because they do end up pretty square otherwise, right?
Yeah, I don't actually taper them because I find it easier to get the nice tight wraps if they're all one length. I've tried doing the tapering. They do tend to just flop around on me, and I can live with the square. Usually, I'll put a couple wraps in front, and that sort of starts to build a ramp. And the
Yeah.
great thing about Sally Hansen is that it has a bit of mass to it, more so than head cement does. So my first coat on I guess on a fly that I'm going to sell to somebody would be like, Celire or this is Prolac that I've had for a million years. And that penetrates the thread wraps. And then the next one would be black Sally Hansen's, and that covers up any, if there's little bits of fur or anything that are not black sitting there, I'll cover those up. And sometimes I'll work those in with my fingers, like once the nail polish starts to dry up a little bit. And then the
Mhm.
final coat, once that's dry, would be your Sally Hansen's, and that's got a bit of thickness to it, and that'll fix all your troubles.
Nice. All right. So you've had a minute to think about it then. What do you think is the key to a salmon catching fly? Like
A
realizing
salmon catching
color
fly.
might work or different size might work in a given day, but yeah, what makes a salmon fly?
So I think there's a couple of different classifications of a salmon fly, and I have this philosophy that you're always fishing to one of two fish. You're fishing to uh, I am stagnant in this river and just sort of acting out of instinct, on a whim fish, or get out of my way. I'm going up here to reproduce. I'm a sexually aggressive fish. One of those two. And so you're encountering option two at the very, very beginning of the season when the run first starts to move in, often when they're still in tidal water, when they've got the sea lice on them. Or at the very end of the season, you're higher upriver, they're putting on their spawning colors, they're getting ready to move up. At that point, they're thinking about almost nothing else. And those are the sexually aggressive fish. And then the other ones are more like your summer fish that have been sitting in the pools for a while. And I think when you're targeting the summer fish, you want something that's sort of small, sort of intriguing, something that piques their interest or might cause them to take as if they were feeding. Controversially, I think that every single fly, including the rusty rat, is a shrimp pattern in disguise. I think it's very unlikely that they're thinking a bomber is a caterpillar or something. If you look at the profile of a bomber or a Carter's bug from under the water, it looks like a shrimp, right? It's got the long, flowy, webby hackles and then kind of a tapered, thick body. That's what a shrimp looks like, and that's what they're used to feeding on in the ocean. So I think every fly is kind of a shrimp pattern until you get to the sexually aggressive fish. And then what you're trying to do is make them think that you are a precocious par trying to move in on their territory. They will swat at par. Par will try and mate with the female salmon. So if you tie like I don't know, this is a fly I've caught a lot of fish on. It's just a wine and gray colored marabou. When this gets wet, it slicks right down. It's got kind of a bait fishy profile. They slap that out of the way, no problem, right?
Yep. And with the what about like larger flies? Like what's your kind of philosophy on something like a sunray or something when you bust that out?
I think that falls into that second category still, right? Because that's a sunray is essentially just a smelt pattern or a bait fishy pattern or a par pattern.
Mm.
Obviously, like if you're in an area where there is a legal kelp season, sunrays work great because they look like smelt that the kelts are feeding on.
Yeah.
But I've seen them work really well on those like bright summer fish that are rolling through. There's a couple of like Scandinavian patterns that I fish as well on tubes that time of year, and I've had good luck. Or like I said, at the end of the year when they're getting closer to spawning, and sometimes at like dusk when they're trying to like find a good position in the pool, they might want to move up overnight when it cools off. Sometimes those dusk fish get pretty aggressive as well, and I think they're in the same mindset as that option two fish, right?
Cool. That's a great answer. Nice. Well, that was a good warm-up, Fly. I think you did a nice job.
Yeah,
No other questions I'm seeing. Uh, why don't you take us to round two? Explain what we're doing.
yeah, round two. So I figured for another fly we could tie, one of my all-time favorites, and if you heard me talk to SoFly last year, this is the fly I think I would be. It's one of my favorite patterns. It's called the Lady Caroline. I've got an example one here. Um, it's a fairly unassuming fly, right? There's nothing, it's fairly drab. There's nothing particularly swanky about it when you think of like old school or more traditional patterns. But in sort of keeping with the other patterns from the River Spey, it's dull. It's got a nice flat back of this bronze mallard. Not much in the way of a tail. A lot of them didn't have tails, but this one has a nice little bit of golden pheasant for a tail. But all the colors are fairly muted, and the profile is the same on essentially every spay fly. They were tied very intentionally as shrimp patterns, same as D flies. All of them were just shrimp patterns, and they worked quite well on those rivers. So we're going to tie one of those up today. I think the only part of this fly that people might struggle with or find intimidating is setting the bronze mallard. Um, I'm here to tell you one of two things. First, that if it does kick up a little on you, it will flatten out in the water. And two, it's not as bad as you think, right? As long as you take a couple of precautions when you're tying it in, it'll set pretty reliably for you. So again, starting with my hook, I'm gonna debarb it. This is a Daiichi 2051, a pretty typical spay fly hook. This is a size 5. For whatever reason, spay fly hooks are, sorry, this is a size 3. I lied to you. For whatever reason, they're measured in odd numbers as opposed to even numbers, but the principle of how they're gauged is the same. A 5 is smaller than a 3 is smaller than a 1. So I'm going to pinch this barb because I will probably fish this fly. It'll go in my box. Oh, the barb. Got this up in this vise. Picked up this vise last year and it has been fantastic. Not met a hook yet that it can't take. Okay. So unlike my last fly, I don't have a little tag on the end. Right? So I had the little gold tag on the end that I could tie in to sort of cover up this space. So since I don't have that for this guy, I'm going to leave my tag end of thread and I'm going to use that as my little ramp. Not as important on this fly because the body is covered in yarn. So it's a little bit less finicky than the floss. The floss really needs a smooth underbody to make sure that it lays flat, but the yarn is going to cover up all the evils. So I don't have to be quite as cautious. I'm a little anal, and this is part of my process. So I'm going to probably do this anyway. So same as the other guy, you'll notice the bend of this hook makes the point at which your thread dangles to the barb a little bit different. So I don't want to be coming down this long bend back here. I'm going to stop right there where it touches the barb to keep my proportions correct. So material number one, this is a golden pheasant skin. For a while there, they were getting kind of hard to find. There was some issues, I think, with exports from China where they're native to. But as far as I'm aware, they're a little bit easier to find again now. But what I'm going to do is find a fairly small feather. I don't want the tiniest one on here, but I also don't need a great big, long, sweeping feather. Go for this guy looks good. So this is what I've chosen. It's not too big. I'm really only interested in this part of the feather. So if I hold that up there, that's what I'm looking for a tail. I'm going to strip away all this fluff and some of the red as well, because again, I only really need that little section. The tails these are not supposed to be big or ornate or sort of swooping or flashy. They're meant to evoke shrimp. So if you think about a shrimp in the water, this would actually be the head, is what we're trying to mimic right now. And then there's the flat back of the shrimp and then the little legs, right, when we tie in the hackles. So I'm pinching this here. I've got a little bit of the fibers still ahead of my fingers when I'm pinching. So they're going to help it lay flat for me. I'm going to put 2 pinch wraps on there and see how we're sitting. At this point, I can adjust, but I actually really like how that's sitting. So I'm going to tie this down, get rid of these fluffs so you're not just looking at fluff. Now I'm going to go for fairly loose wraps up the hook. And I'm going to try to keep it on the top and maybe a little over the side just to try and make up for that bump. Get that off. Like I said, we're covering this whole body in the end with some yarn. So it doesn't super matter if we have nice big open wraps here. The ribs on this guy, there's two ribs on a Lady Caroline and on a lot of other spay flies. They're both gold and they're offset. So you've got one rib going up and then sort of bisecting the open spaces left by that rib, you got the second rib going up. So I'm going to cut myself an ample piece of rib number one. Worth noting too, I've got two pairs of scissors. Anytime you're cutting tinsels, tinsels are murder on good scissors. So keep your tinsel scissors separate. Make sure you're picking up the right pair. I'm gonna ruin a good pair of scissors real quick. So same. I'm gonna tie this on side. And anyone in the chat, please feel free. Let Chris know if you have any questions, and I will do my best to answer them live while they're still relevant. Or if you don't think of them till later, that's fine too. Tie it in on the side. Do our little.
Shelly was asking if you had a name for that wine-colored marabou fly.
I wish it had a name. A lot of our fall marabou patterns here, they're very popular patterns in the fall, have pretty boring names. The most popular one is called the black and blue. I'll let you guess what the materials in the black and blue are. Um, the wine and gray, I've just called the wine and gray over the years. It's definitely not a popular pattern. I haven't seen other people fish that color combo, but it just kind of, I don't know, it speaks to me. And so maybe it's more of a self-fulfilling prophecy thing where because I think the colors look good, I fish it more and thus catch more fish on it. But it works well for me. If you have suggestions for the name, I would love to hear them. That's the tinsel. Where are we? Flat tinsel for option number two. This is one of those little two colors jobbies, right? It's got gold on one side, silver on the other. I'm just going to grab a super long piece. No, I don't need that long. That's wildly long. Okay.
Gotta be careful not to waste mylar. That stuff's hard to find.
Oh yeah, expensive stuff. Only the finest. When I tie my traditional flies, I tie with the real stuff. That is high stakes bingo right there.
Definitely.
You'll cut your hackles in a heartbeat. All right. So I'm tying this on the bottom. My other one is tied off to the side, and I'm going to intentionally make sure that there is a gap between the two of them so that when I start wrapping them, they're offset by that gap. Cool. So that is now there, and I'm going to advance my thread. Unlike sort of modern spay flies, we don't start the hackle at the back. You start the hackle in the middle, even kind of leaning towards the front of the fly, simply because on this fly and some other traditional spay flies, the hackle material is heron. This is probably the only material in this fly that is difficult to come across. But that said, if you don't have heron, there are a ton of feathers that have been used as sort of substitute spay feathers over the years. And even traditionally, there was what they called the spaycock, which was this chicken that was native sort of to the banks of the River Spey. It's no longer in existence. But its feathers were basically what modern schlappen is, right? They're not fancy. A lot of spay flies are just tied with essentially schlappen. You can use ringneck pheasant rump or golden pheasant rump that's dyed, to a more drab color. Heron is the move though, if you've got it. So what I'm going to do, these hackles aren't very long once you strip off the fluff, right? I haven't got a ton of room here. So I'm going to make sure that I'm getting my money's worth out of this hackle. I'm going to separate out as much as I can. And they get a little bit denser as you get near the bottom. So you'll see up at the top here, there's like a fiber, and then there's a, half centimeter or centimeter of space, and then another fiber, and then you get further down and they're all touching one another. So what I'll probably do with this specific hackle, you got to play it by ear, is strip one side, but only farther down. So I'll think about which way this is going to wrap, and then I'm going to strip the inside only when it gets these kind of fibers down here. So that would be about here because I don't want this to be too heavily hackled. I want it fairly sparse. So it gives it all of its nice movement. My friend Bob over the weekend, last weekend, we did a tying seminar together. He was doing striped bass flies, but something he said really stuck with me, and that was that if you cover up the fibers, he was talking about bucktail, but I think it goes for anything. If you've got fibers that are overlapping each other, that are kind of swept back kind of in the same direction in the water column, if the fibers tied in farther forward overlap the ones that are tied in farther backward, their tips are covering the tips underneath them. And the tips are the part that move, right? They've got the most movement. They're the finest part of it. They've got the most movement. And if you're covering up tips, you're just robbing yourself of movement. So, one thing to note as well, heron hackle is notoriously brittle. So, if you do come across some and you decide you're going to attempt this, don't get discouraged. If you break one or two, it does happen. Um, it happens to the best of us. So, keep pressing on. I'm going to grab a lot of this. This is just uni yarn in bronze. You can use yarn from Michael's. I have done it on many, many flies, and it's fine. It's a lot cheaper, but I happen to have this here, so I'll use it. I'm going to grab a pretty long piece, um, frankly, because I'm a bad judge of how long of a piece I need, and I'd much rather have too much. All right, we're going to tie that in right up front. Now, you could do this in rotary, but where I've got kind of the hackle in the way and stuff, I think I'm going to do this one wrap at a time. So bear with me, your viewer. We will get there. When I get past the heron hackle, it will become a little bit more unruly to do this wrapping. So I'll show you something you can do. So this is my last turn at the heron hackle, and I'm going to move it over, take a turn there. I'm just going to grab some hackle pliers here. I'm going to use those to hold tension on this body. I'm going to move the heron hackle up here. I'm just going to put a loose wrap over top of it. That's going to help keep it out of the way. Yeah. Pull pliers out of there, and we will keep wrapping. All the way to the back, and then we'll cover it up again, and that'll build up a little bit of bulk in the body. I really don't like the look of really skinny bodies on any salmon flies. That's, I mean, part of why I'm trying to fill that gap that I talked about, with the return eye. Whoop, bumping the camera. We're still good there. Okay. Trying to fill that gap up because I want bulk in the body. So if I haven't filled it up and I've got that little bump, that tells me I have not filled the body quite enough. So if you think about like a shrimp or anything, it's none of their bodies are, you know, a quarter of a pencil in diameter. It's gonna give them something to bite into. Okay, we're almost back. That hackle is tied in. It's hard for you to see, I'm sure, but I can see the spot here on my side where I tied it in. One more turn. Okay, so at this point here, I'm going to just back off the turns I made up here. There we go. Take my time, straighten this out, and move it over here and start wrapping in front of it. Hopefully that's the boring bit done with. Get this out of the way, get a couple of turns there, and then we can cut this off. So I don't want to be cynical, but I always leave a little bit because you'd hate to have to go all the way back if something went wrong. All right, I'm going to start with my flat tinsel. So I'm just going to start wrapping that. Again, I'm looking for about 5 turns. It's not really the end of the world. My goal here is that uh, the stronger of the tinsels, so that would be the oval tinsel, is going to land sort of on top of and just in front of the hackle. It's going to help protect it in the water. It's like fish teeth, which you're hopefully going to see lots of. Dozens and dozens of fish teeth. Same. I'm going to cut, leaving a little tag for insurance. All right, next. Like I said, bisecting the space that we left. Now, when I get to the hackle here, I'm not perfectly center, so I'm going to let this cover the hackle a little bit because you'll never see that, and that's going to ensure that it's protected. So again, bisecting the open spaces, no big deal, and we can tie that rib off. Cool. All right, now we wrap the body hackle. There is a throat in this as well. Worst case scenario, if you were to break the body hackle, you could just tie in 2 throats. Sometimes, like I said, these hair and feathers are not super long in their usable sections. So if you run short and you run out of feather by the time you get to the front, you can just tie another one in alongside your throat, and no one will be the wiser. It's so swept back and swooshy looking that it all sort of just blends together. So I'm just going to do a couple of turns up here just to add a little bit of substance. Not a ton, because again, I don't need it to be a bulky fly. Okay. We've like 3 fibers left. Let's just take them. Here we go. Catch that in. Hold everything down firmly. And top it. Oh, so at this point, the scary bit's over and I can trim everything away. Again, using my not so great scissors for the stuff that could damage scissors. And then for the stuff I want to be a bit more precise, I can grab my better scissors. I won't say great scissors because these are fairly old, but they're sharper than those other ones. Cool. So tidy that up just a smidge. Now we're going to tie in the throat. I am going to sweep these fibers downwards because they're a little bit unruly right now. But I'm going to wait till the throat's in to do that because there's no point in doing it twice. Now for this guy, I want a feather with fibers that are long, but not as long as these guys, because again, I don't want to cover the tips with other tips and lose that movement. And I don't need much. I need like 1 to 2 turns, depending on how dense this is. So I'm going to take a lot of this underside off that I don't need. Okay. So same as before, we're going to isolate the tip of this feather. I'm just pulling the fibers down and out of the way. I'm going to do the same thing on both sides. So that's not a lot of feather, but that's really all we need, especially if you use both sides. If you find you have more feather, you could do the same thing we did over here with the hair and hackle. You could strip the inside if you're not liking how much feather you got going on. All right, so same as before. I take my tying wax. I'm going to get a good coating right there. Now I don't want to go too far down because when I get to the bronze mallard, which is our next step, I distinctly don't want wax wraps. And I'll tell you why when we get there. So to lock this in, use up all that wax thread. Same as before, just fold it now that it's tied in. There, now it's wrapping. two, and that is lots. Let's take this off of here. Now we have our throat. So I'm just going to clean up a little bit, make sure I have a nice flat surface on which I'm going to tie in the bronze mallard. Now I'm going to take some time and just sort of work these fibers to one side or the other. So I'm going to sort of look down the center line of the fly. Can't really tell, but my head is ominously looming over top of this, like the sun baby in Teletubbies. I'm just watching, looking down the center line, trying to fold as much as I can. I'm just giving it a good pinch, right? So even with that, we are sitting mostly on the underside now. If you had like really problem fibers and you were getting pretty anal about it, like this guy here is probably not going to lay down nicely, you can pull him out. Cool. Now we have a nice sparse looking, but very webby, very shrimpy looking set of hackles on here. It's time for the bronze mallard. So this is the material I think, if you're unfamiliar with working with it, seems a little bit intimidating to work with. I've got two feathers here, right and a left. Usually when you buy them, they come in pairs. This is a pair I've had for a very long time. You'll see what I've done is I have stripped the bad side, so the side that isn't bronze, usually the shorter side. And I've also stripped away all the fluff, and I've stripped even some into the good side because some of this is all just sort of white feathers, and then they just don't look good, right? Something to bear in mind when you're picking these feathers, you can't tie a bronze mallard feather in close to the bronze. You got to tie it in the white. If you start tying closer to the ends of the feather, it will split on you. But if you tie it in close to the white, it all stays together nicely. Another trick for keeping it together nicely is to leave the stem attached. So if you cut, it's called the rachis, I guess, technically, if you want to get into bird bits. So I cut the stem off there. I'm going to take my bodkin, just like my scissors, I keep two bodkins. One is for glue and one is for finesse. Take the finesse bodkin. I'm going to separate out the amount of a wing that I want. So I'm looking for probably about that kind of width, right? Nothing crazy. And I actually am going to take two sections. So I'm going to cut the first one off. This is uh, the left slip. So this is going to be my side. Take that section I separated. I'm going to cut the stem right there. That's wing slip number one. And I'm going to grab another one. You might be screaming and saying, well, aren't those going to be both the wrong side? Yes, yes, they are. But we're going to use two on each side. Going to help give you a nice solid wing. And they also will help prop each other up while you're setting it. It'll give you less trouble. So I've cut my two. Now the second one that I cut, the one that's closer to the top of the feather, will probably be a bit longer and a bit browner just based on the nature of these feathers. That's the one I want showing. So I'm going to use that one on top and the other one will sort of prop it up underneath. So same thing with the right. I'm going to cut away the stem. I'm going to separate out approximately the same size wing. Get there. Separate those fibers. Grab my good scissors. Off the stem. Okay, that's the first right. And then I'll do the same thing again. That's the second right. Set aside these rest of these feathers. You don't get too many wings out of one pair of feathers that way, if you're using two every time, but you will get nicer, more consistent wings. So I don't know, pick your battles. It's a whole lot more expensive if you keep wasting wings. All right, so what I've done now, I've taken those two rights that I just cut off and I've stacked them on top of each other so they look like one piece. I'm going to put those in my right hand. I'm going to do the same thing with the lefts that are on my desk, just stack them one on top of another. Swap those over here. Now what I'm going to do is try to line up their tips. If I put them in my hand such that they align like so, now I'm going to lay them out on top and see where they're going to sit. They're going to sit and just cover the body, right in just barely into the tail, right to the back of the hook. That is perfect. So again, I can only tie the whites. And what I'm going to do is sort of tent them as I push them together. Now I have a little tent. And what I can do is lay a single wrap on top, straighten them out, tighten up, do it again, do it again, do it again. Here we go. With that nice little set. It's not going to go anywhere. You can work those a little bit and you get yourself a nice little tent that lays very flat. So now, as long as I put wraps in front and I don't put wraps behind where I just did, that wing's not going to move. So I'll secure it down with a few in front, and I'll grab my good scissors, and one stem section at a time, I will cut those free. So yeah, I promised you before that I would tell you why I didn't want those waxed. And the reason is because when I compress these wings, I want them to slip and slide over one another and compress all sort of like an accordion as much as possible. If I use wax, that will want to pull them to the side because it's sticky, and they'll never compress the way you want. And that goes for married wings as well. If you're ever tying traditional flies, never, never, never when you're setting wraps on bare feather, would you want to use wax? Stems, yes. Feather, no. Okay, so there we go. We've got those ends trimmed off. We're just going to tidy this up. Add a few little wraps to tidy it up, make a neat head, and that looks great. I have one throat feather here that's being a bit of a party pooper. I am a little anal, so there he goes. Now we'll finish this guy off. One, two, three, four. Always moving ahead again, trying not to let my wraps go over one another. And we will bring this guy off. Just like that. Throw the old 2 million-year-old Prolac on there. You smell the head cement. It's like gasoline. Like it shouldn't smell good, but it does.
I like the smell of head cement in the morning.
Nothing quite like it.
Yeah.
Gets you going. There's your Lady Caroline. I hope I made it seem not so intimidating.
You made
It's
it
really a fun
seem,
pattern to tie.
my fear is actually that you made it look so easy that people are going to think that you're like the best tire in the world. And so, of course, they can't tie it. I think that's the real concern here.
Well, you flatter me, but
Way to
I hope I
relax.
haven't made it seem that way. I would love for people to tie this fly, and all the other spay flies, actually. There's a fantastic book called Spay Flies and How to Tie Them by Bob Vaverka. He's recently passed in the last few years, but phenomenal resource. Tying your way through that will fill an entire winter in a heartbeat. So keep your eyes out.
Yeah, it's a good one. Definitely. Cool. Well, thanks for doing that, Mitchell. That was really nicely done. If people want to get a hold of you, I feel like there are a few people from out east watching. I think most of them know you, but I'm sure folks over the years will see this as well. If they want to reach out and book you, how would they do that?
I mean, the best way is probably through Instagram. I'm at Life Between Lines on Instagram. I'm fairly active on there and check my messages plenty. So reach out there. I have an email as well. It's mitchell.lifebetweenlines@gmail.com, but Instagram will probably get you a response quicker.
Nice. Very cool. I know you swing by Toronto every once in a while, so hope to see you again when you're in town. But yeah, again, it was awesome. Thank you very much.
No problem at all. My pleasure. I look forward to the next time I get to crash the party in Toronto.
Yeah, it was fun. And yeah, maybe we'll pin you down to do something. We tried to keep things a little bit more approachable and like catfishy style flies today. Just we weren't sure if people had the patience for like a 4 hour stream on a full dress pattern, but maybe we'll get you back for some more advanced stuff at some point too. It'd be fun.
Yeah, I would love to make traditional salmon flies seem a little bit more accessible for people. It's certainly something that I'm passionate about, and I feel like there's a few little tips and tricks along the way that can get people started a little easier.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I think you laid a good foundation today as well, right? Like showing body and floss work and the winging, like a lot of that stuff is translates super well. I'm sure it'll help some folks who are dabbling with that. So That's nicely done.
Definitely very transferable skills for sure.
Yeah. And just good skills too. Like people look at these things and they think I'll never fish that. Like you described, I know some of your flies as wall hangers, like they're not going to see water. But if you can tie these flies cleanly, your trout flies are going to get that much better too, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, the Lady Caroline, I don't know if I said it while I was tying it, but I've hooked a number of Atlantic salmon on a Lady Caroline. It is a very fishy pattern.
Steelhead
And
fly.
it's, at least semi-traditional. Yeah, fantastic steelhead pattern too, right? So add it to your boxes. Go get yourself some bronze mallard. It's not that scary.
Yep, we got lots in shot. Cool. All right. Well, thank you. If anyone has questions, feel free to reach out to Mitchell online, or you can get a hold of them through the shop if you want to message us as well. And this will be up on YouTube shortly for you to rewatch if you want to tie along. Have a good night, Mitchell, and everyone
You
else. And
too.
yeah, chat soon.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. See you.
Bye.